uh, I will see if I can spotlight you, but you can get started. I'll put you on.
This is Lydia. My sign name is L. Brown for the interpreters. Thank you. I'm wearing a t-shirt that says the whole damn system is guilty as hell. The image that is on it is of the power fist. I'm describing what it is because I thought that that message might resonate with some of the others who are here this evening. I don't know most of you, so thank you for coming to spend this time with me tonight. I'll ask you, just to get started, if each person could write in the chat box how familiar you feel that you are with the concept of disability justice. So you type in, how familiar you think you are.
I'm not able to write.
I'll put it in for you, Jess. What do you want me to write?
A little bit, but I need to know more. Thank you so much.
Great. It appears from the responses that many people are saying, I know a little bit, but need to know more. I'm familiar, but still learning more. Those are the general tenor of the responses here. We're here this evening at a moment in time when disabled people who are at the margins of the margins, that is, disabled people who are Black, Brown, Native, Asian, or mixed race, disabled people who are queer or trans, disabled people who are from impoverished communities, immigrant communities, and other marginalized and targeted communities are at deep and serious risk of death because of structural, systemic, and institutional ableism, racism, and classism that we have always faced, that we have always struggled against, and not always won against, but which poses particular and pernicious threat to our lives and our continued survival in a global pandemic where our governments and our institutions that we would theoretically wish or hope would act in our interests actually act directly and intentionally to deprive, extract, and exploit us, and to treat us as expendable and disposable. There's a comment here from Xochitl that I'm assuming it's interchangeable with disability rights activism. And I'm here tonight to talk to you about how disability justice and disability rights are very profoundly different from one another. They are not even remotely interchangeable or synonymous. And many people make that mistake. Many people throughout different progressive communities, as well as supposedly radical or revolutionary communities, all make the mistake of believing that disability justice essentially is another cool way of saying disability rights. And in reality, disability rights is rooted in addressing legal and policy change as a way of helping, saving, or improving the position or condition of disabled people. That is, disability rights work brought us the ADA. Disability rights work brought us the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the Olmstead VLC decision from 1999. Disability rights work asked us to advocate against the use and development of policies at the state or federal level that enable care rationing and discrimination against disabled people because of COVID. And disability justice understands that while disability rights work is necessary, it is insufficient and inadequate. As we all know, with the 30th anniversary of the ADA, it has been 3 decades since the ADA was passed into law. And yet, disabled people are routinely and repeatedly denied the most basic rights. Disabled people are left for dead. Disabled people are discriminated against and segregated and institutionalized at the school age as adults for the rest of our lives. disabled people continue to face extraordinary rates of sexual violence, of police violence, of homelessness, of under, and precarious employment, of houselessness and precarious housing, precarious access to food, and of denial and deprivation of access to language. And all of those experiences are multiplied and magnified and amplified for disabled people who live at the intersections. That is, the numbers that we have available to us, numbers that indicate that disabled people are 7 times more likely to encounter police, that doctors are more than twice as likely to make rapid and dangerous life or death decisions if they know that their patient has a developmental disability. Statistics that tell us that disabled people comprise up to and perhaps more than 80% of those who are killed by police and incarcerated are not disambiguated or disaggregated statistics. That is, those numbers collapse all disabled people into a single group. They do not pull out what happens for trans disabled people, for Black, brown, or Native disabled people, for disabled people who are low income or who are immigrants. And we know from work in other communities and movements that those numbers are also disturbing and horrific in what the statistics tell us about the systemic and institutional and structural forms of oppression that we face. When disabled people who live at the margins of the margins experience houselessness, a landlord's discrimination, an employer's threat of firing, and therefore loss of access to healthcare, loss of access to stable housing or to food, loss of access to safety, that is only magnified and exacerbated to the point of becoming deadly for disabled people who are at the margins of the margins. Talila Lewis says that that race and disability is the most dangerous intersection that history has ever created. We can look to our forebears in every single movement and see that sick, mad, disabled, and neurodivergent people have always been at the front lines. Marsha P. Johnson, who is one of the trans women of color who led the Stonewall riots against police criminalization, surveillance, and assault on queer and trans people, particularly poor trans people of color, was also openly mad and disabled, a survivor of forced institutionalization, including long-term psychiatric hospitalization and imputations of criminality due to alleged psychiatric deficiency. And that for all of us in communities that have been targeted for surveillance, for criminalization and pathologization, have experienced what happens when ableist logic is intertwined with and made necessary for other forms of oppression. And we see that play out throughout history, and we see it play out today. Where one of the easiest ways to undermine somebody's legitimacy, Susan, you're not muted.
Oh, sorry.
One of the easiest ways to undermine somebody's legitimacy or validity is to attack their supposed physical or mental capacity. That is, even in spaces that are allegedly progressive, for example, one of the most common sets of attacks used on Donald Trump's fitness to be president is that he is physically incapable. He can't walk down a ramp straight without holding onto a railing, or that he must be mentally defective somehow. He doesn't know how to spell. He doesn't know how to communicate in words. He doesn't read or like to read. He must be stupid. He must be mentally ill. Instead of thinking, for example, this is a person who is in an openly aligned with white supremacists, someone who is admitted to sexual assault, someone who is a notorious racist and misogynist, and someone who is horrifically ableist in his past experiences and in his presidency. Those are very different critiques that we should be making, but instead it's easier and it's lazier to say this is somebody who is mentally incompetent. In essence, to say the reason that Donald Trump shouldn't be president is because he's some kind of disabled, rather than maybe it's because he's a white supremacist. Maybe it's because he's a misogynist. And so ableism is insidious and pervasive in every single movement, in every single community. Ableism teaches us that disabled people's bodies and minds will always be expendable and will always be disposable. And that is true even in disabled communities because we do it to one another. Ableism goes far beyond what the law allows or does not allow. Because according to the laws, disabled people are supposed to have equality of access and equality of opportunity. But according to reality and to lived experience, that couldn't be farther from the truth. According to the law and according to policies, Disabled people are considered a part of inclusion and diversity initiatives. But according to reality, it is queer and trans disabled people of color who are the first to be pushed out of any organization, even and often especially disabled-led organizations. This is true both within and outside the US. It is true across disability movements. It is not unique or particular to any one. Ableism is so pervasive that we use it on one another, and yet we find it easy to attempt to call out other communities or movements for their ableism without ever examining both our own ableism within disabled community and the ways in which disabled organizations are predominantly male-led, white-led, and led by people who are moneyed and degreed. That is, we replicate the very same forms of oppression, the very same streams and divisions and distribution of resources and access to a platform and to privilege and to power as we are allegedly fighting against. And we do that without once considering how we are participating actively in, we are investing in the same systems that spell death and destruction for us. Disability justice helps us understand that the problem of ableism cannot be legislated out of existence. The problem of ableism cannot be eradicated through reforming law, through repealing laws, or even through creating new laws. The problem of ableism will never be eradicated by well-meaning or well-intentioned organizations or institutions, particularly those whose very existence is predicated upon the continued existence of ableism and other forms of oppression. Disability justice helps us to understand that ending ableism requires us to end capitalism, to end white supremacy, to end settler colonialism, and to end ableism in disability movements and disability spaces. It is not optional. Disability justice makes space for our anger. Disability justice makes safe spaces for our grief and our mourning. Because for disabled people at the margins of the margins, it is normal for us to see our peers and community members die, completely avoidable and preventable deaths at young ages. Why? Because impoverishment is deliberate, and it is a cause and consequence of disability, and disability is a cause and a consequence of impoverishment. I say impoverishment deliberately because to say poverty is to grant permission for those in power to exculpate themselves of responsibility for upholding systems that rely upon extractive, harmful, and capitalist economies. When we say impoverishment, we recognize that there are agents and actors at play. That is, those who are born into generational wealth, those who attain wealth, and those who seek to align themselves with wealth and with degrees and with whiteness and with other forms of privilege and power act deliberately. There is no accident. It is not passive, something that happens in the background that we can then exculpate ourselves from and refuse to take accountability for our own participation in it. Disability justice helps us to understand that all of these processes that we name, that we acknowledge, exist actively. They are self-perpetuating and they require and demand our active investment and participation. Whether it is in how we choose who we select as leaders for disability organizations. We choose whose work we deem worth paying for or not paying for when a paycheck can mean the difference between making rent or not making rent. We choose whose work we consider worthy of showing and whose we do not. And I am very keenly aware that for me, as someone who occupies a position of multiple forms of marginalization and also multiple forms of access to privilege, that is deeply complicated. I find myself frequently the only disabled person of color in an otherwise all-white disability organization or otherwise all-white disability-related event. And I know that more often than not, the reason that I am present in such spaces is because the white people who run those spaces believe that I am more palatable and acceptable because I'm a light-skinned East Asian with the last name Brown. And that were it not for those aspects of my relative or conditional, or at least contextual access to some form of privilege, that I would not be afforded those same opportunities. I know also that even in disabled spaces, sometimes the reason that I am asked or invited to be part of a particular conversation is because I've published work. It's because I have credentials, I have a degree, I have letters after my name. And people will say, those are amazing accomplishments. You should be proud of that. We're very proud to know you. You've done this great work. You are an example. But you know what that does? It positions and it situates me as worthy of respect based on arbitrarily and ableist defined modes of accomplishment and achievement. That is, it says that my value is based upon what degrees I hold and what accomplishments I have achieved, rather than that my value is rooted in my worth as a human. We do this to each other and we do it to ourselves consistently. Disabled spaces are not and have never been exempt from the same forces that we seek to fight against outside of our own communities. Disability justice gives us tools to understand that, to challenge it, and ultimately to build a society where all of the violences that we grapple with become inconceivable and unimaginable. It offers us the opportunity to consider what a world would be like in which there is no more ableism. There is no more expectation that our value is defined based on productivity or our capacity to reproduce and to reproduce what is considered healthy and strong. That our value is no longer based in presumptions about our sanity or our stability or our supposed independence. But instead, that we can understand ourselves as valuable in the ways, not despite, in the ways that we are dependent, that we are needy, that we have needs bodily, mentally, and otherwise, that we are people who deserve and need care and rest, that we are fundamentally interdependent, that not a single one of us is fully independent. Disability justice offers us an opportunity to imagine what care looks like when we all build collective and community models of care, rather than leaving it only, ever, and always to those who are most marginalized to bear 1,000 times the weight of the work that those with more power, privilege, and resources consistently fail to do. Disability justice offers us an opportunity to imagine and to build what it will be like to live in a world where we are respected for our whole, authentic, genuine selves, not merely for those parts of our experience and identity that become palatable or acceptable to those who already have power, but for the parts of us that are uncomfortable and messy, the parts of us that are broken, the parts of us that are hard, the parts of us that have been told for our whole lives, that's too difficult for me, that's too uncomfortable for me, I don't know that I'll ever be able to pronounce your name, I don't know that I'll ever be able to get your pronouns right, it's hard for me to listen to you talk because I don't understand you because of your speech disability, you just make me uncomfortable in your room, I don't know if you're going to burst out in anger or not, I don't know if you're going to need to pee here or not, I don't know if you're going to be able to eat here or not, and it's just too hard to plan for your meals, it's too hard to plan for your language access. You're too hard. You are too much. What would it be like to live in a world where that is no longer the litany with which we are faced each time we find ourselves in a space where we think we ought to belong, but instead find again only an open wound and a reminder that we are not wanted or valued except in name only. Disability justice asks us to imagine what it is like to feel as though we can breathe, as though we can be, as though we do not have to sacrifice parts of ourselves only to appease the people who find parts of our identities, experiences, the trauma that we have survived too much for them, without an inkling of a thought as to what it is like to be the person who has had to survive that trauma instead. What would a world be like that does not rely upon punishment, upon segregation, on prisons and other carceral systems? What would a world be like in which education is not measured based on ableist and racist ideas of intellect and intelligence, in which education is not assessed based upon modes that assume a certain pace and capacity for learning and knowledge and ability to demonstrate that knowledge? What would an economy look like that practices generative and redistributive principles instead of exploitative and extractive ones? What would it look like to reconsider how we divide and how we take on labor that accounts for work that must be done, that we want done for ourselves and our communities, and that is not exploitative and extractive of those who have no power to opt out? What does it mean to create a society in which we all have access to safe places to live, to communities that we choose, to the supports that we want and need on our own terms that respect our dignity and autonomy and that do not make access to support conditional upon our compliance, our behavior, or our palatability? What does it mean to put control directly into the hands of the people who have the most to lose? What does it mean not to have to worry about what the next traumatizing experience will be? What does it mean to consider institutions and prisons and segregated schools as history, unimaginable? I want each of you to take just a couple of minutes to yourself out loud or in the chat if you can, and think, what would it feel like for you to feel free, to feel justice? What is missing from your life in your work now? What do you long for? And if there are folks who would like to share into the chat box, please do.
What's on your necklace?
The necklace that I'm wearing just says Allah in Arabic. It's on the image of a mosque.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Some of the responses in the chat box from David. I strongly disagree with your mischaracterization of people in abusive power being those who are male and white. Persons of power are in positions such as judges and prosecutors of all nationalities, genders, and sexual preferences who commit Black on Black crimes. Most crimes being committed today by agents of Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. I'm not going to continue reading this racist vitriol, and you can show yourself out because I'm not going to speak to you anymore. Goodbye. From Susan, I feel my son has I would feel my son has a future without my support. He has Down syndrome and is Taino. Worry about him after I'm gone, what the world would be like for him. From Anthony, a society that supports the needs of others rather than capitalizes or profits upon them. And from Tamika, I want people with disabilities to be truly valued in society, are some of the other responses that I've received that are not full of racist bullshit.
For me, one of my things is that I would appreciate it if the people that manage my, that like basically pay for my care would see me as a person and not just a person based on my diagnoses or what they think I can and can't do, because it's different for every person. So I hope you don't mind that I said something.
Oh, I appreciate it. Thank you for sharing.
I'm also sorry you had to go through that other thing.
Well, that was my mistake for reading the comment out loud.
Okay.
Were there any other last comments that other people wanted to add in the chat box, if you can? And from Jason, oh, I see 2 comments, excuse me. From Allie first, I long for a world where disability is valued as an asset, where medical care is not rationed to those who are quote unquote deserving. And from Jason, I long for being able to have a place of my own someday where I'm able to speak up to people, even if it's something I disagree with. I long for speaking up and being able to confront my own fears as well. In disability organizing and in other organizing spaces, some of the ableist practices that we often enable and perpetuate are the expectation that people have to prove that they are adequate or sufficient as activists by the number of events they show up to, by the amount of work they do, by the number of times they go to a conference, by the number of times they participate in an action, by their ability to participate in policy advocacy meetings, by their ability to pursue classes, whether in a formal or an informal program, about disability or advocacy or policy work. And that the more of these things that somebody does, the better an activist they are considered to be. And all that this does in the end is reinforce the idea that in order to be considered sufficiently valuable as a person, you have to prove that you count as a person. Rather than being respected as a person from the outset, you are told that you have to constantly prove that you've done enough work to deserve respect or to be treated as human. And this is, at its core, nothing more than crass and blatant ableism. And yet we do it to one another. We do it in disability space and we do it in other movements for civil rights and social justice. We create spaces where it becomes a mark of shame for people to rest, to say no, or to take a break, where it becomes a mark of weakness and where weakness is moralized as bad and negative if somebody needs to take time to move back, to take a break, if somebody is not able to do something today or this month or tomorrow. And that in the end, that people have to continually prove that they are only disabled in ways that don't affect their ability to participate in things, to engage, to show strength, to show what will be considered to be mental stability or intelligence. As long as you can show those things, then you're considered to be acceptable. And the instant we think, well, now you're acting like you're kind of dumb. Now you're acting like you're kind of crazy. Now you're acting like you're really crippled. Suddenly, our own community members become discounted. Suddenly, our own community members are subject to the same violent ableism that we are on the receiving end of outside of disability community, done by our own. Because we internalize and invest in the very same violent mythologies. Disability justice offers us among its core principles, and I saw that 1 or 2 people had earlier mentioned that you're familiar with that it is at its core a practice of intersectionality and cross-movement solidarity. Those are 2 of the principles. To do work that values intersectionality and solidarity means recognizing the linkages between different communities and movements that are targeted by different forms of oppression. Now, the only thing that David, who commented earlier, said that I happen to agree with is that yes, it is people in positions of power who act on that power. And the reason why is because white supremacy and capitalism and ableism reward acting in accordance with power. You are given credit. You are offered the opportunity to experience some bit of privilege, even if you're a marginalized person, if you agree to participate in a carceral system, if you agree to become the social worker who can rip people's children away, who can deprive people of access to the money they need to eat. You become rewarded if you join the police force and you decide to participate in actively committing violence against the community that you come from, because you can now do so with impunity as an agent of the state. You are rewarded if you decide to invest in and assimilate into the systems of power that otherwise would tell you that you count as less than. And you know what? People will accept that and believe it because you are incentivized to participate in those systems. You are incentivized to do so. Disability justice helps us recognize that power is multidimensional, that ableism is inextricable from capitalist oppression, that extracts people's labor, exploits people's body minds, and then disposes of us once we are no longer of use, once we can no longer produce sufficiently or quickly enough or the right thing or in the right modality. Ableism is inextricable with eugenics, because eugenics tells us which people ought to exist and to continue to exist, which people ought to reproduce and be reproduced, and which kinds of human beings deserve to live, and which instead should not even be provided the most basic medical care because our lives are deemed not worth living and not worth saving. Ableism is inextricably linked with white supremacy because white supremacy is at its core a system of values about which people's body minds matter, about which people count as fully human, about which people are mentally and physically acceptable or even superior, and which people are instead deficient mentally, physically, emotionally, or even culturally or civilizationally. All forms of oppression are both necessary for and dependent on ableism, and ableism is both necessary for and dependent on all other systems of oppression. And so disability justice honors our experiences, our histories, our collective traumas, our current struggles by recognizing that intersectional work is not an option, but a requirement. As Audre Lorde had told us, there is no such thing as single issue struggles because we do not live single issue lives. Disability justice also recognizes the necessity and the urgency of intersectional work through its insistence on cross-movement solidarity. That is, both recognizing that disabled people's movements will never win in ending ableism if we do not also commit to ending misogyny or white supremacy or ableism itself or capitalism or settler colonialism, but also that disabled people's movements are already intertwined with and entangled with other movements for justice and for liberation. Because disabled queer and trans people, because disabled people of color, because disabled immigrants, because disabled poor people, because disabled workers, because disabled people of minority religions and faith communities are all fighting for multiple fronts. Because we're fighting for our lives in a world where the way that power is divided is set out to kill us by design. David, I'm kicking you out of the Zoom and you can call me abusive all you like. I don't care. Whoever knows David, please get him in line. In any case, I just wanted to conclude our discussion tonight in introducing the topic of disability justice by outlining one final aspect of the work which it offers us, which is the opportunity and the necessity to do collective work in order to achieve access and to achieve liberation, which are two of the principles outlined in the 10 Principles of Disability Justice. Collective access is a recognition that access does not come by us working in silos or individually, but it comes by working collaboratively and intentionally. And likewise, that liberation does not come by attempting to believe that our movements can operate separately or independently, but rather in understanding the inherent interconnections and the ways in which, if our struggles are bound up together, then the fights for our freedom and for justice for all of us are also deeply and necessarily interconnected as well. I'm not going to be speaking any further tonight, so I'm just going to open this to additional questions, which you can put into the comment box, or you can indicate that you'd like to speak by raising your hand or making another indication, verbally, movement, or typing, that you have a question or a comment.
Tamika has her hand raised.
Great, Tamika, and then Jess, I see you next. Jess Martin, that is.
Yes, thank you very much for that talk, and that's just is really important, and Nadia, what you're saying, because just be a black woman with a disability and have living that intersectionality, and I definitely agree with the principles so much that I now say that I'm a disability justice activist. So, and people, kind of like, well, what is that? And everything, I have to explain it. But that really, disability justice really, in my mind, really shows the work that I do and the work that needs to be done within the disability community and across, like I said, all communities. We need to have disability justice as the framework, in the work that we do. So, thank you. And I'm good friends with Leroy Moore, so I know Leroy's another founding person with disability justice. So yeah, thank you for coming up with this and and putting this forth.
Thank you. Yes, the co-creators of disability justice as a framework were queer and trans and disabled people of color. Leroy Moore is one of them, Patricia Byrne and Eli Clare and Sebastian Margaret and Mia Mingus are among the others. And their work continues today. And then Jess Martin, I saw that you had a question.
Yeah, when I first came out, the second person said, the first person said, "Are you sure you want to do this?" And then the second person said, "Don't you have enough to deal with?" And I'm like, it's not a choice. It's what happened. It's not a choice. And how can we help people not to feel that way and get more respect that way? People who are not in any of the minorities, like, I'm sure they're in their own, but like not well known at least. And both of these people, one of them had a disability, but the other one didn't do anything. So, I'm sorry, that's my bad. That was my. So that would be my question for you now.
Would you be able to repeat the first part of the question? I'm not sure I fully caught it.
Okay, the first part of the question is, what can I do so that other people realize it's not a choice? because it's like first, yeah, that's what I'm gonna get at.
This
Yes.
is Leah. I feel very strongly that even if you try your best to help other people understand, there comes a point when there are people who will refuse to understand. And if you reach that point with somebody, it is no longer your responsibility to make somebody understand. Because at the end of the day, we only have responsibility and control over ourselves and our own actions and what we choose to do and what we refuse to do. So if someone refuses to understand why you do the work that you do and why you are out and open about being a person with a disability, then once you've attempted to try to talk about it to them, if you choose to do that, if they refuse to understand and to continue to belittle you and your work and to ask seemingly innocent but actually very, very not so well hidden attacking questions of you that denigrate you, then you don't have a responsibility to respond to that anymore.
Thank you so much.
Tamika, do you have a second question? Is that you virtually raising your hand, or is that just still up from earlier?
I'm sorry, I gotta take it down.
There's a question in the chat from Jason that says, I'm happy that you spoke tonight and reiterated very articulately better than I could, explaining about the effect of ableism and what ableism is. I wonder if there's a way to explain ableism to people with IDD I worked with in the past who live in group homes in plain language. There are some excellent resources that Self-Advocates Becoming Empowered and that Kids as Self-Advocates, CASA, have published that talk about ableism and disability discrimination and oppression written in plain language. The way that I tend to explain it is that ableism is a way of thinking that hurts disabled people. It's how people act and think that hurt disabled people. And that is as straightforward and as plain as I can put it. Are there any other questions or comments about what disability justice is? Elaine, I see your hand.
I just wanted to say I'm sorry, but I have to go now. But thank you for your talk and keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Jess. You have a
Jess.
good night, and thank you for coming.
You're
See you
welcome.
later.
See you later.
Lydia, so I know you kind of touched on it, but I was wondering if you could further clarify, like examples of how you see fellow disabled people kind of having positions of power or having that same prejudice against kind of like disability with other people, if that kind of makes sense.
I'll often hear people who primarily have physical disabilities make comments to me that say things like, well, my mind works fine, which implies that the reason that that person should experience rights and respect is because they're considered mentally normal, which of course sends the very strong message that people who have a mental disability do not deserve the same rights or respect. Or likewise, I've often heard people in the autistic community who do not have intellectual disabilities say things like autism is a difference. It's not like it's mental retardation, which again sends the message that it's okay to be autistic without an intellectual disability. But any person who has an intellectual disability does not deserve the same acceptance or rights or respect. And those are just examples of things that people say. How it actually plays out looks like, for example, a large blind organization refusing to provide deafblind access, or a very large disability organization that is supposed to be cross-disability refusing to provide captioning, refusing to provide any materials in advance for the people who need it in advance. It can be an organization that claims it supports people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, but all the people in power do not have an intellectual disability. The people who are advisors often control the group, and the advisors rarely have an intellectual disability. Those are all examples of ableism that occurs laterally within
Thank you.
disabled communities.
So if you don't mind, I'd like to share, as you were kind of talking, that brought up an experience I have a lot as someone with an invisible disability, that I see like the core groups of usually kind of people in wheelchairs and deaf and or blind individuals kind of forgetting there's other nuances of us, like TBI individuals or chronic pain or something, that in the way you're saying that they form the heads of organizations and kind of forget to account for different types of disabilities like ours. So would
Yeah.
you agree that that's it?
Well, I'm a person with multiple neurological and cognitive disabilities, and I've been there every day for years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right there. Does that help answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
Great. Elaine, I know you've been waiting to speak, and then I see Tamika raise a hand again after you.
Okay. I believe that disability justice is the most hopeful thing for everyone in this world right now, because disability justice is totally and completely inclusive of each individual exactly as we are, and without judgment, but with affirmation that we are beautiful and valuable as we are, without hierarchy. And yet, each of us have gifts also. It's just, to me, it is just such a beautiful thing that out of so much struggle for so many years, one of my songs, Not Dead Yet, the outcasts of the outcasts become the leaders of today, and the ones we used to throw away to die are teaching us a better way. I'm positive if you're HIV, you can understand this song. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when AIDS was a new thing. And as a member of the queer community, that was huge back then, that pandemic. And here we are with another pandemic. And who are the ones that are lifting up what is the possible way forward, inclusively, survival for everyone? It's our people. It is through disability justice. Yay. So thankful I've lived long enough to be a part of it.
Thank you for sharing that. I was part of a panel discussion earlier today on disability justice and HIV. And we spoke a lot about the interconnections between communities of people with HIV and disabled communities that largely are not inclusive of people with HIV. And I think that panel is available online for you to take a look at if you'd like. I have another question that comes from Anthony, which is there a place or a role for disability studies within disability justice? And my response to that is that it's very complicated. I personally do work at the periphery of disability studies. I teach in a disability studies program, and I've published in disability studies works. And like disability rights, disability studies is also predominantly white people, many non-disabled people in the space, including with tenure and with major publications. And it's largely one that focuses on degree because it's an academic field. And so it cares very much about what degree a person may have or what education a person may have. And while the field is often more welcoming to people outside of a traditional scholarship background than other academic fields might be, it's nonetheless not a place where some of the most radical thought and work is happening, even though there are people often within disability studies space who work in grassroots movements, who work on the ground, and who are in meaningful and genuine partnership and collaboration with directly impacted communities. And of course, some who come from directly impacted communities ourselves. Does that make sense? Does that help to address your question?
Yes, that was great. Thank you so much.
Great. Were there any other last questions or comments?
Do you mind sharing what it is you did study in college? Because I'm always interested to like see what people studied in and kind of where they ended up their trajectory.
Sure. Thank you, Viola. It was nice to have you. So Chitlin, are you in college now or are you out of college?
I am out from undergrad, but I'm hoping to go to grad school in the next couple of years once I take care of a couple health issues.
Where did you go to school? What were you doing?
ASU, and unfortunately, because I had a lot of what has become part of my disability startup at the very start of college, I didn't get to change to a degree I would have liked. So I did business and sustainability. Sustainability I loved, but I'm just curious to see where people, if like you study disability rights or something like that.
I did not. I was an Arabic language major and I had a psychology minor.
Oh, okay.
I
So-
did not actually take any disability related classes while I was a student for a variety of reasons. One of them being that at the time, 100% of the faculty who taught disability studies were all white people, and that made me very deeply uncomfortable.
Okay. Yeah, that was another kind of with the ableism of just a different ism where a lot of leaders in the groups are often white. As a woman of color, I get it. So shukran.
Off one. And Jason just commented a lot of people are here tonight. I hope a lot of people learn when it goes on YouTube as well. Thank you all, and I will be signing off for the night, but you are all welcome to stay if you would like to stay instead.